So thanks very much to the organizers for having us. I believe that we'll have time for questions. As you know, my job is to offer a critique. This is a great characteristic of some of these WFH sessions, and I'll say that critique doesn't necessarily mean criticism, and I won't necessarily criticize the trials, but I might criticize some of the implications that we've come to from them, as you'll see. These are my disclosures. Like my colleagues, I've consulted for many of the companies who make many of these products. With regard to off-label use, I just wanted to mention that nobody's label specifically mentions using both a longer and a standard acting product at the same time, but I'll at least mention that. Oh, okay. So I got it over here. Long arms. Let's just make sure I'm on the right slide. So, in this critique, I want to reiterate some of the things that you've already heard. The first is the consequence of the difference in half-life prolongation between the factor 8 and factor 9s. This has been confused in many of our minds, not for any evil reason, but because some of the technologies are the same, but the implications are different. I want to talk about the very complicated relationship of the pivotal trial results that you've heard about to pricing and dosing strategies. I want to talk about variability in half-life that you've already heard some my colleagues allude to. These have pricing consequences which are terribly important, and this will be one of my most important messages to get across. And then at least to mention the bigger world that we're in. Longer half-life products are in a world now of novel agents and of shorter acting factors as well. So, I will claim that the improvements in factor 8 half-life, for which you've seen the data, are incremental. Most patients may not achieve meaningful prolongation of interval with a 1.5 times longer half-life. Some may not. So far, as you heard from Dr. Malangu, this is true from all brands, from all manufacturers. It's a fundamental limitation of the current extended half-life factor 8s. On the other hand, the improvements in factor 9 half-life seem to be groundbreaking and allow all kinds of new strategies because of the long prolongation of intervals to weekly or even less frequently, maintaining higher trough levels. And as you heard, the properties of the two available types of fusion protein factor 9s right now, one conjugated to FC and one conjugated to albumin, use the same mechanism, that is to say the neonatal FC receptor, but they don't have the same kinetic properties. And so sometimes understanding the biochemistry of cell biology won't tell you what the clinical outcomes and plans will be. And then if this is a new concept to you, let me tell you about it now. There's the so-called value proposition. This is, the drug companies take this idea up a lot. And a simple example, no trumps, just drugs. If you have a drug that's twice a day, if you could only make it once a day at twice the dose, so extended release Prilosec, let's just say, patients would take it better, the results would be more reliable, and so on. And if everything else were equal and you charged exactly double for taking it half as often, that would be fair. But that's worth something, and the worth something is called the value proposition. And the value proposition has, in my humble opinion, gotten a little out of hand in extended half-life factors, and we'll see if you agree or not. This is a slide from Professor Collins' talk at this meeting in Paris in 2012 to remind us that prophylaxis might be tailored by life stage because different people have different activity levels. Many adults just need prophylaxis before their weekend sporting events. Toddlers who leap off of things, we need to be careful with them. School-age kids are so much more active, teens way more and play sports. And then some patients have so-called burned-out joints. Those joints won't bleed anymore, and they may need a different strategy. And the fact is, a person, any of you, if you're prescribing these drugs, could optimize the cost or optimize the levels for sports or work activity or optimize infusion frequency or the schedule of infusions, or the trough levels, and you've heard all of those mentioned already today. But the fact is, it's not possible to optimize all of those. It's simply impossible. So there are some choices, and that depends on the patient's values, frankly, and on what's practical and feasible. This is just a slide that we made thinking about a patient who had an average half-life of factor VIII FC of 18 hours, about 1.5 times the typical adult half-life of 12 hours, to compare a regimen that's related to the label in a way of 25 units per kilogram every third day or 50 units per kilogram every fourth day. And on the higher dose less often, the patients spend more time in the blue, which is levels not required for prophylaxis. 50% is normal. There's no expectation, in the low normal range, there's no expectation people would have higher levels than that too frequently. So that may not be necessary. And on the other hand, the patient actually spends more time at a lower level when the doses are made less frequent. This is a fundamental property of any drug where you're at several times the half-life and you try and get over it with a higher dose. And I always just remind people, non-bleeding disorder patients, you really, if you're going to take aspirin for your headache, it's 2 aspirin every 4 hours, because if you tried to take 4 aspirin every 8 hours, you'd be partially aspirin poisoned, and part of the time you'd still have a headache. So here's one of my main messages. I have not too many beefs with the pivotal trials for the longer-acting factor VIII and factor IX molecules. You've seen the data. It's been disseminated in the field. It maybe drives what we do. But wait, how do we use pivotal trial data to decide how to treat patients? Well, it turns out that's complicated. The point of pivotal phase 3 trials is to bring data to the regulators. The regulators must approve a label. The label has a lot of sway in how people use factor, but it's not the be-all, end-all of how people use factor, or any drug for that matter. And then the companies must also decide a price, and the price is related to how long the drug lasts compared to the current drug. It's related to the price of the current drug. And when you have new exciting properties like a longer half-life, in a part it's related to the value proposition. That's okay. But it turns out that there are many factors that influence this that you and I as prescribers, or you as a patient with your prescriber, don't necessarily control. The first is that there are completely external factors. Those are whether or not there are competitors in the space and the price of those competitors in the space, and the input from the regulators. And it turns out that at least for factor IX FC, there may have been a large role from the regulator in deciding the dosing strategies on the label. And I wasn't there, and so I don't know the details, but that's the word on the street. Biological factors also matter, and you've already heard about those, but let me make clear that they affect this triangle. They include the properties of each product, but also the variability among patients because of variable pharmacokinetics, and the patient age for the reasons that Dr. Young mentioned. An easy example of how it's not necessary to do what's on a label is about a drug not in this space at all, but it's the replacement enzymes for the Gaucher disease type 1. In this disease, the purified enzyme and then recombinant enzyme, which came along a few years later in the 1990s, somehow got a traditional label dose of 60 units per kilogram twice a month, which makes it one of the most expensive drugs used in the United States and in most of the world. But way more than 2/3 of patients can get by on half that dose and do just fine. It's not a case of more is better. The risk is not a joint bleed if you use a lower dose. And so most of the world uses half the dose at mercifully half the cost. Now, you've already seen these graphs in many different forms, but I'd like to make a couple of examples, and I actually wonder if I can point with the mouse or not without touching any buttons. So this happens to be the recombinant factor IX albumin fusion protein with the paper in blood from Dr. Sanagostino at 25 and 50 units per kilo of the study drug, and you've already heard about the very long half-life, and 168 hours is a week, so a week is out here. And then 230-something hours or 320-something hours is 2 weeks. And here's a standard acting factor IX over here. So these drugs last a long time, and this is a non-logarithmic curve. And I'm just going to use these curves as examples in the next few graphs, but to be careful and compare them to this one, which is the same data published on a logarithmic scale. So here would be 80, 40, 20, 10. And if you're not used to looking at these, here's 80, 40, 20, 10 crammed all the way into this small range. And for simple so-called first-order degradation or removal, this line should be straight. And it just so happens that for factor IX albumin fusion protein, it's fairly straight. Let me just say one more thing about this one before I go on. These nice tight error bars are in the context of a clinical trial where all of the patients got their values done at exactly the same times, and you get these nice standard deviations. So in our region, in the region 1 in the Northeast United States, this happens to be for factor VIII FC. My colleague Stacy Croto and I asked some of our colleagues kindly to send in some of the data that they're using to determine their own individualized pharmacokinetics. And this is 8 patients worth. It's on a log scale, just as I've told you. And we let people do whatever their local standard is for this. So this ranges from 3 data points to 8 data points. And you can see there's an astonishing variability in the time to 3 or 1% factor, with the fastest patient reaching 1% in 60 hours. But look at this. This is a factor VIII FC. We've just said the half-life isn't that great on the average, but this person is way above 3% at 5 days. And so my second big point is, if you haven't been measuring this for your patients, or if you're a patient and you haven't gotten it measured, you might want to know, because the time you spend near zero is related to your activity level and your dosing strategy. And this is just a plug for Professor Iorio's program at McMaster University, the WAPS Hemopharmacokinetics program that we and others have been using to take the raw data that we're getting and make half-lives out of them. It's a fantastic program. You put in patient characteristics, the weight, and some other data if you know it. It spits out amazing assessments from the time of the doses, and there are the results that come out. And it's been a huge help to us, and I know he's discussed this at major international meetings and will continue to, but I urge you to think about how you can integrate these data. All right, so here's my first data point where I want you to pay attention to the data themselves, which is in this case, factor IX FC, and this is from the pivotal paper by Dr. Powell. And we've already asserted that if you see this 3 times in one session, it's probably okay. I'll try and make different points than my colleagues. The first is that here's a week over here, and as Johnny referred to with the different strategies in this particular trial, you could extend the interval, but the goal was to keep the level more than 1%, which is why this error bar goes down to exactly 1% at 240 days, which is 10 days. So this is a log scale, but it's not straight, and the half-life down here at this end is around 86 hours. But over here, it goes from 60% to 15% much more quickly. The second thing that's important that we've already talked about is these error bars reflect the variability where all of interesting medicine happens. If we all fell on the mean, we wouldn't have to do any PK. We would just dose people up and send them on their way. I've already mentioned this. The goal here was to keep it above 1%. That's hard to do in real life, and as you've heard, maybe 1% won't be the target anymore, so we won't dwell on the exact number. And finally, this is a log scale, but it's curved, and so we know it's not first-order decay, and we know that something complicated is going on. And so a lot of the assumptions we do in our head about half-lives don't work very much. And I'm going to show you in a minute the same data from this top curve from factor IX FC on a linear scale, and you'll be amazed about how fast it drops from 60% to 9%. It's the same data as this, folks, just plotted on a different y-axis. Now, next, we'll consider the cost considerations. So the manufacturer of factor IX FC was first in this space and therefore had to decide what to do about pricing. And Dr. Croto and I have published an editorial about this that you can read in Hemophilia. But I just want to walk you through how we did the modeling and what the consequences are. So there are two strategies for standard factor 9 and two strategies for extended factor half-life 9. And you could do the same math yourself on any strategy that you're using for any factor. I'm just going to show you the example that we published. So we know that the published average wholesale price, as it's called, for recombinant factor 9 when it came out was $2.85 a unit. That would buy more and more pounds in London today, wouldn't it? But anyway. And we know that the company wanted to equate a common regimen for standard acting factor 9 to their once-weekly standard regimen of factor of the extended half-life factor 9. And that's why these costs, which at these prices come to just about $515,000 per patient per year for 70 kilos, are almost equal. That was, we hear, intentional from the manufacturer. I'd like to point out that my center uses this regimen for factor 9 standard acting of 40 units per kilo twice weekly, which is already only about 60% of the price of this standard. But you heard from Dr. Young that it's pretty common for factor 9 regimens to be in this range of right around 125 units per kilogram per week. And we did a survey in our region, and in fact, it might even have been a little more than that. So this is pretty typical in the U.S. My center uses a little less. And these two are set to parity. So this is one of the two label strategies that I mentioned, 50 units per kilo once weekly. But look at the other label strategy, which is 100 units per kilo every 10 days. So as Dr. Young mentioned, this one costs 30% more. So this is now $728,000 per patient per year at the average wholesale price, or about 2.4 times our base price, or about 30% more than this base price. If somebody's taking a factor weekly, they save 52 infusions per year compared to our baseline of twice a week. Twice a week's 104, once a week is 52. If you could get it to every 10 days, that's only 35 and a half infusions per year, so they save 67 infusions per year. This is good. But what are the implications? So here's the challenge. So here's strategy 1 from the label, 50 units per kilo once a week. Here's strategy 2 from the label, 100 units per kilo every 10 days. So compared to my center, this is 1.7 times as expensive, and this is 2.4 times as expensive. The difference between the two strategies is 15 infusions per year. The premium cost for this regimen is $13,900 per dose saved. $13,000 per dose saved, and the annual factor usage is, as Dr. Young said, it's close to 30% more. The longer interval leads to unnecessarily high peaks, longer troughs at lower times, and I'm going to pose to you that this is a problem for the community. For our pharmacy program, I go and talk to insurers in the region. I might show them this data. And my personal idea is that all of the treaters in the room should really eschew the 100 units per kilo every 10 days, just like we eschew the labeled dose for glucocerebrosidase for Gaucher disease as unnecessarily expensive. Now, who am I to say that it's not worth $13,900 per dose saved? Well, we've tried this out on some insurers. Do a thought experiment. Let's say the insurer said to the patient, I'll pay you $5,000 for every dose not saved. If you'll do it weekly and I pay you $5,000 extra 13 times, you'll make money, we'll save a bundle, and the money won't just go directly to the manufacturer. Now, you might disagree with my politics about this, but I don't think you can disagree with the math. And I would urge you to search your hearts and see, isn't this really a problem for the community because the weekly is superior pharmacokinetically? Now, I told you that the regulator had something to do with the pricing strategy on the label. So I will give the manufacturer a small break in this regard because the actual strategy in the pivotal trial was to start at 10 days but go for longer if a patient was able. And you've seen that one of my patients and one of Dr. Young's patients and one of Dr. Malangu's patients in the trials were easily able to go longer and keep their levels up. And I have no problem with that whatsoever, because if you took 100 per kilo every 2 weeks, it would cost just the same as 50 units per kilo every 1 week, although I'll tell you that the troughs are still unnecessarily low and the peaks are still unnecessarily high. And if I've only planted the seed in your mind that you as a patient and you as a doctor have some control over this and could have better troughs for minor inconvenience at much lower cost, isn't that worthwhile? I told you I'd come back to the data from the Powell paper, from the pivotal phase 3 paper. This is from my editorial with Dr. Croto to consider what would we do during a week if a patient taking factor IX FC had a bleed. And the green line that drops rapidly here and goes through, the green line turns out to represent the data from the pivotal clinical trial of the average patient on factor IX FC, and you can see that by 48 hours the level drops to just around 11% or something like that. We took 2 patients from our clinic with their real half-lives. One of them has a slower degradation of factor IX, and one of them has a slightly faster degradation of factor IX, shown in blue, and asked if they bled, if we treated them on Friday, what should they do on Saturday or Monday or Wednesday about treating for the next bleed? And it seems to us with this particular product, if you treat within 24 hours, if you bleed within 24 hours, or you twist your ankle playing soccer or football, as you may call it, maybe you don't need any extra factor at all because your level's terrific. If it's between about 24 and 72 hours with this product at this dose, maybe these patients should get something different, but it depends on their own personal half-life and what their level is and how bad the trauma is. So there's a lot of clinical art that will go into this that will never be reflected in the clinical trial. And so I really endorse what Dr. Young and Dr. Malangu have told you about this. As this penetrates into the community, every center will get some experience with the drug and learn about the different patients' half-lives and different strategies. But if this is weekly dosing and it's between about 72 hours and 5 days, these patients have hemophilia again over here, and they really should get another dose of factor IX. And we've proposed, why not give them standard-acting factor IX? It costs half as much. It works just as well. And it doesn't matter that in the pivotal trial, the more expensive drug was able to treat the bleed because the cheaper drug is able to treat the bleed. And we're especially worried about this with the extremely long-acting factor IXs, which would be even more expensive, but the problem would be next week, not this week. Finally, if somebody bleeds, say, between day 5 and 7, since we know these drugs are perfectly adequate for treating bleeds, just advance their next dose, and that'll be fine. And they could take their next dose and go right along, and that would be a perfectly adequate solution for everybody. Let me turn now and just make a comment or two about the availability of these drugs in the world of different treatments. So, first of all, emicizumab. If there's going to be a factor VIII mimetic that's sub-Q with a very long half-life that eventually penetrates into the field, what would the role be for the current longer-acting factor VIIIs? Well, they don't last this long, and depending on the price and the clinical efficacy, that might be a challenge for these drugs. What about for gene therapy? Here I'm thinking especially about factor IX and what Dr. Malangu already said about trough levels. The fact of the extremely long-acting factor IXs, the albumin fusion protein and the forthcoming N9-GP, suggests that the trough levels, if you look at the clinical trial results, the trough levels could easily be way over 15%. And so a gene therapy strategy that was devised to keep somebody from being severe with a level of 3, 4, 5%, that was a brilliant success not long ago. It was a lead article in the New England Journal. It was a plenary paper at ASH. But the field is changing. And so this is changing the target for gene therapy, especially in factor IX, even as we walk along. And I don't know what the ultimate implications will be, but I feel that it's going to be a big deal because we're all creeping up on those trough levels. They're the strategies to reduce the inhibitors of coagulation, the fitusiran and the inhibitors of tissue factor pathway that you heard about this morning. We have no idea how these factors fit into that, but just imagine someday that real prophylaxis for factor VIII would be a little inhibitor and a little long-acting drug at the same time. Wouldn't that be interesting? And I'll just say the usual cop-out that this is going to take some trials in the future, but this is the world we're coming to, and so I would pay close attention. The manufacturers of products that don't have polyethylene glycol often whisper in our ear, isn't the polyethylene glycol a problem? And my honest answer is I don't know. Published, there are no safety signals so far. You all may know that PEG is used to prolong survival of many drugs in many fields, but not all of them are used weekly for decades, and so that's not really clear. I will say that in the factor VIII molecules, factor VIII has very high specific activity, and therefore you don't get very many molecules of PEG per dose of factor VIII. Factor IX is very much less efficient per mole, and so you get a lot more molecules, but now the intervals are very long, and so you may still not get very many molecules per year. The pivotal trials definitely did not answer this question, so in terms of a critique of this, I'd give them a pass. That wasn't their... If they saw an acute safety signal, we'd know, but that's not really the question that all the people in the room have now. So my editorial opinion would be to keep an open mind about this and look for long-term safety data. And then finally, Sipit, I just wanted to remind you, I'm sure you all know, none of the current factors that we've talked about were tested in Sipit. The most recent MASAC recommendations about Sipit remind us that the newer factors get a pass. What we really need is the previously untreated patient data for all of these factors, which are not yet forthcoming. So some of these factors are approved for all ages, but as Dr. Young said, that doesn't mean they're necessarily wise to use in pups until there's published data. And as you've heard, there are clear potential advantages of the longer-acting factors in pups, not the least of which is better prophylaxis, which is the goal, after all, with fewer infusions and less of a need for indwelling catheters. So, I have some questions, but I think it's a perfect time to open this up. I'm going to finish by reminding you of this complicated relationship between pivotal trial results, the label, and the price. I hope I've raised your consciousness about this and you'll pay close attention. And to summarize, the pivotal trials of these agents have been positive and generally convincing. I heard Dr. Malengu's point about comparing apples to oranges, prophylaxis to on-demand therapy. I took that to be because the bleeding frequency with current factors, standard acting, is so low that it's hard to do the clinical trials. So I'm a little sympathetic about that, but I take your point. The devil is in the details. Higher price for longer half-life depends on the magnitude of the value proposition. How trials translate into treatment recommendations is complicated. And as Dr. Young and Dr. Malengu both made very clear, you need to consider the factor VIII and factor IX prolongations entirely separately, even when the same technology is used, because the consequences are very different. Thanks very much.